This is Gemara and Beitzah Daf Chav Beis. The learning for this week, the week of Sukkot, has been generously sponsored as Chosi and Neshama. Zahav Abbas David Ali, who started was in Zayin Tishrei. The learning of the Torah Chabura should be a tremendous as Chos Ilin Nishmasa, as well as Chos for Shleim of Shlomo Ben Yita. You should have a continuous recovery, as well as Choshid of Shachayim and the very Shemirim Bas Yiz Gittel Shendel Estel Bas Shana Malkal Yom Mordechai Ben Dav Shendel Esther Gittel Bas Dav Shendel. They should find the receiver Hagin Bekarev, as well as Chos for Shleim of Shmuel Yosef Ben Yoveda Men of Vegachaim Resara Shom Zivim Reizel Zar Bas Kanandi Yita Basim as Chayser Solomon Mendel Ben Relay Shamas Nami Bashavik Shechan Shmom Til Din Mechan Reizel Melchai Basim the Brach was Musa Deneno Shin Minasi of Hegron Chalash Lehuva Rivka Bas Bashav Dalzim Mechlester Pesach Shar Choli Yisrael. We're holding in the bottom of Chav Aleph Amud Beis, the second Mishnah on the bottom, working towards the end of the second parak of the Sechus Beitzah, the Daf for the second day of Yontif, which of course we're going to try to get up early. For those who would like to walk into Yontif, have already done the Daf. Says the Mishnah, Shloisha Devarim Rav Gamliel Hechmer Kedivrei Beis Shammai. There are three matters that Rav Gamliel, and as much as he was a Talmud and a descendant of Beis Hillel, 3 times he was changing like Beis Shammai. Number one, you're not allowed to hide something in order to keep it warm, of course, referring to the discussion of Erev Tavshilin, referring to doing it on Yontif for the upcoming Shabbos. L'chatila at first. B'Yontif, number one. Number two, b'Yontif. And you cannot put together a menorah candelabra, which we'll see in the Gemara what that means. And number three, b'Yontif gritin ella rikikin. You're not allowed to bake thick loaves of bread. Ella rikikin, only thin loaves. So 3 times Rav Gamliel was stringent like the opinion of Beis Shammai. Seemingly Beis Shammai was machmer. In these 3 cases, Beis Hillel was mekel. In these 3 cases, Rav Gamliel sided with the opinion of Beis Shammai. Rav Gamliel miyimim shel Beis Abba, for all the days in my father's household, lo ya'ofen pitin geritin ella rikikin. They never would bake the thick geschmack loaves. Rather, they would bake the little wafers and yontif. They responded to Rav Gamliel, very nice, that's what your father did. That your father was machmir alatzon, and it was a stringency he took upon himself. But yet we know that your father, Malkilan l'chol Yisrael, he was lenient for anyone else. The Yosef beating Geritze v'chararim, allowing them to make the thick loaves, cold baked bread. So you, Rav Gamliel, you're telling over a story from your father as if that's the binding practice for Klal Yisrael. But we know that your father himself would be lenient for others. And he was only stringent upon himself. Says the Gemara, Heichi Dami. What exactly is this case? The case that we're seeing that we're being machmir like Beis Shammai and not like the opinion of Beis Hillel. Says the Gemara, did you or did you not make an Erev Tavshilin? Of course, an Erev Tavshilin, the invention that we've seen this entire parak, allowing you to cook, to prepare from Yontif for the upcoming Shabbos. So what is the case in this Parishna? Did they make an Erev Tavshilin? Then what's the obvious problem? My time in the Beis Shammai. So why did Beis Shammai say, don't do atmana, don't take your pot and put it inside the coal, take your pot and put it under the blankets on Yontif for the upcoming Shabbos? Why not? You made an Erev Tavshilin. And let's see, you'll tell me you didn't make the Erev Tavshilin. So what's the obvious kasha? My time in the Beis Hillel. Where does Beis Hillel come from? Allowing you to prepare. We know if you didn't make an Erev Tavshilin, you're not allowed to prepare for Yontif the Shabbos. So what is the case in the Mishnah? What would be the case in which Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, would debate whether you're allowed to make these preparations, whether they did or did not make an Erev Tavshilin? One of the opinions is very difficult. So answers the Gemara, the first Torah, says Rav Huna, I'll tell you, they did not make an Erev Tavshilin. So you're going to ask me, so why does Beis Hillel allow you to do any preparations? A tremendous dispensation. In order that you have some sort of food on Shabbos, the Rabbanan were lenient. And the Gemara now explains that Rav Huna is in reality l'taimei. Dam Rav Huna, the last line, so that forgot to make an Erev Tavshilin, what is he allowed to do? So you think nothing. You have no Erev Tavshilin, you're not allowed to prepare from Yontif the Shabbos. Yet, says Rav Huna, Oifen lo'ipaz, how to make bread, achas, 1 loaf of bread. Uvash l'kedera achas, you're allowed to bake 1 dish. Moving over to today's Daf Chav Beis. Uma'alikin lo'is, and you're not allowed to light 1 candle. Mishum Rav Yitzchak, Rav Selim, Rav Katan, even allowed to make 1 small little fish. So what do we see? We see that Rav Huna is of the opinion that even without an Erev Tavshilin, we allow you to do the bare bone necessities, so you have some sort of food on Shabbos. We have a Beitzah that corroborates this point. You make one bread, you do atmana on one dish, you're allowed to heat up one jug of water. And some say, even make a raw, one little fish. Since the first answer, the answer of Avuna, that the case that you did not make an Erev Tavshilin. So why would Beitzah allow you to do anything, a special dispensation allowance? So you have some sort of food on Shabbos. We allow you on Yom Tov to make the bare bone, one dish, one atmana, one soup, etc. Rava comes along and he argues on Rav Huna, and Rava says, no, really, you made an Erev Tavshilin. If you made an Erev Tavshilin, it's why does Beis Shammai not allow you to prepare? Says Rava, you made an Erev Tavshilin, so why not do atmana? A special chumrah, a special stringency on atmana, because it's something that's nicker, it's muchach, it's apparent, everyone can readily see. What are you doing? You're going to hide something in. Obviously, you're doing it for Shabbos. So in that case, everyone would agree, even with an Erev Tavshilin, a massive chumrah, you're not allowed to do it because it's muchach, it's nicker, it's recognizable, it's apparent that what you're doing is preparing for our Shabbos. Abaye is not so happy. As Abaye to Rav, you just told me a tremendous chumrah. You just told me that even with an Erev Tavshilin, you're not allowed to do all preparations. But asks Abaye, Chananya Omer, Beis Shammai, Chananya explained Beis Shammai. You're not allowed to bake unless you made Erev Tavshilin with bread. Vein Mavashlan, you cannot cook. Unless you made Erev with a cooked dish. Vein time, then you're not allowed to do atmana. But what do we see clearly? Let's say you did atmana. Let's say you had a dish prepared for Shabbos. What's the halacha? Miyuavid. Then you're allowed to prepare. You're allowed to do more atmana from Yom Tov to Shabbos, and the Beitzah speaks out. And even though to Mucha Milsa, it's readily, it's apparent, it's obvious to all. Yeah, we see it's allowed. So you, Rabbi, you just came along with a massive stringency that if it's nicker, if it's apparent, you're not allowed to. Ask Zavaya, we see clearly in the Beitzah not that way. We see clearly that even though everyone can see what you're doing, it's still allowed. Answers the Gemara, Abaye gives another teretz. Really, we're going with Chanani, we're going with Beis Shammai, and we're discussing a case that you did not make a full-fledged Erev. Like the Beitzah said, if you bake, you can bake. If you cook, you cook. You did atmana, you do atmana. The case here would be that which you did not do, that would you not be allowed to do on Yom Tov in preparation for Shabbos. Says the Gemara, the 2 dots, 13 lines down, continuing the din of the Mishnah, these 3 cases in which Rav Gamliel was stringent for the opinion of Beis Shammai. Says the Gemara, what was case number 2, being Zoikfin, as ha-menorah. You know that literally straighten a menorah candelabra. What exactly is going on here? Says the Gemara. My Kovid, what are you doing? What's the problem? What's the malach at hand? Hearkening us back to the days of Gemara and Shabbos, where there was a candelabra, made of multiple parts, and you're clicking pieces back together. It looks like you're building. And so what's the stringency? The Beis Shammai Savri, Yesh Binin Bekelim, Beisel Savri, and Binin Bekelim. So if Gamliel is machmer like Beis Shammai not to build utensils. Vein Sir Bekelim says Beisilal. Ula Klai the Rav Yehuda says Gemara, a story that Ula went to visit the Yeshiva of Yehuda. Kam Shammai Zakula the Sharga, he saw the Shamish get up. And what did he do? He siphoned off a bit of the oil. He strained up the lamb, Zakula the Sharga, in order to let it burn properly. I asked Rav Yehuda to Ula, what's going on in your yeshiva? You're not allowed to add on, or you're not allowed to take off oil. So what are they doing playing with the candelabra? Ula responds, I didn't tell him to do it. I know what you're talking about. They didn't tell me that's what they were doing. So don't ask me any questions. I agree with you that it is forbidden. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav, the 2 dots about 20 lines down. First word of the line is Amar Le, Amar Rav, Kanva, Shari. Trimming a wick is allowed in Yom Tov, and now we're going to get into the discussion which we started yesterday and a few days before. When are things allowed? For what level of cooking, what level of Shabbat L'chol Nafesh that everyone needs it? Do we extend the allowance for cooking on Yontif to include other items? So says the Rav, Kanva, trimming a wick is going to be permitted on Yontif. Says the Gemara, asked the Gemara, Abba Bar Marta Me'abayu. So Abba Bar Marta asked Abaye the following question. Are you allowed to put out a fire in order for husband and wife to be together? It's forbidden in front of a light. Are you allowed to put out a fire for that purpose? Amar Loi, so Abaye responded, what do you mean? What's the big necessity over here? You're coming and asking, do we have a leniency? Do we allow for something? Answer Abaye, go to another house. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Let's say you don't have another house, then what's halacha mai? You create a partition. The halacha is if there's a partition blocking between the light and you, then everything is allowed. So you can create a partition on Yontif. What if I can't make the partition? Now what's halacha? Says the Gemara, you can put a kli on top of the light to block the light effectively. A good old-fashioned Shabbos lamp. So what's going on over here? Is it allowed or not? Says the Gemara, aim likely, you don't have a utensil to do that. What's halacha? After all the different steps, what's halacha? Also, it's going to be forbidden. Eisvei, but ask the Gemara, 1 second. You're telling me that it is forbidden. Eisvei, ask the Gemara, ein machaben es abekas k'dei lachum aleho. You're not allowed to extinguish a piece of wood in order to k'dei lach saleh, or to save the wood. But however, v'im b'shvil shleis sashin abayis. Let's say the fire is burning and it's making the house have smoke, it's making the house dirty, or the pot, then mutter, then it is allowed. So we see that there is a time, there is a level of putting out a fire is considered a need of Yontif. So why in our case that we said a moment ago, did you just explain that for the husband and wife to be together, it's not considered a Yontif need? Again, we're trying to figure out how far can we extend the cooking, the allowance of playing with a fire for cooking purposes. So we're seeing over here in this Beitzah that B'shul Shlois Sashin Abayis, it's allowed. So why would our case be any different? Amar Lei responds to the Gemara, who Rabbi Yehudi, a very important rule, bringing us back to the very famous machlokes of Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, that is going to Rabbi Yehuda, whereas we are going with the Rabbanan. We can take one moment to see Rashi over here. Rashi points out, where does Rabbi Yehuda get the point that not only is cooking allowed, but even other auxiliary types of cooking processes is allowed? V'darish yaseh lochem. For all your necessities. It's one of your needs. And we, which hold it's forbidden, is why the Rabbanan said, no, it's only for cooking. It's not going to include all other sidebar, other auxiliary processes that surround cooking. So says the Gemara, and this is going to be the answer that we're going to have numerous times here. Whenever we have a question, we say, oh, that's a Yehuda that allows you to extend the allowance to cook. But we go with the Rabbanan that does not. So Abaye asked from Rabba further. Malchava says that the law could be Yontif, let it put out the fire in Yontif. So says, well, what is the case? You're asking, can you put out a match? Put out a fire. What's the case? If it's God forbid a sakana, there's no question. Of course, everything's allowed if it's a sakana. What's the question? Are you allowed to put it out to save yourself money? What's halacha? Amar Lei responded, also. But Eisvei, you're telling me it's also the same Beitzah. So we see we extend the allowance, but at a fire. So why are you telling me to save money is not included in this allowance? Answers the Gemara, the same Teres, that Rabbi Yehudi, the Rabbanan, that's Rabbi Yehuda, was more liberal and lenient with extending the allowance for cooking, whereas we are going with the opinion of the Rabbanan. Fundamental shayla, which is going to bring a tremendous yisai. Are you allowed to put out an eye ointment? It's not really a makeup, it's more of a remedy, like we've seen in the Gemara Shabbos. You're allowed to put that on Yontif. Says the Gemara, what's the case? Hey, chadikas sakana again. If it's a kafir, bit of sakana the vashais. Kigayin rear ditza dama demasa kedach lev techlata ochla. That's not a question. If it's any of these different types of diseases, there's a discharge in the eye, there's a pricking pain, there's a blood concession, there's a tearing, there's a burning. Basically, any time with chilas ochla, the beginning of any of these diseases, which could potentially be fatal, there's no question. Why not? That even on Shabbos it's mut. What am I asking? What about at the end of the disease? What is the halacha in order to improve one's vision? Are you allowed to put on this eye ointment on Yantif? Amrlei responds, also, we have the same question. Last hour, you're allowed to put out the fire. But we see that if you're doing it for something that everyone would need, it is allowed. So why here isn't this allowed? We answered like a Meimar answered. We answered like we answered before, that what? That's going to Rabbi Yehuda, that's more liberal, that extends it further, whereas we are going with your Rabbanan. But Meimar says, the Gemara, Meimar actually indeed, Shari lemichal eina minechru b'shabbat. He said, if you want a guy to put on that eye ointment, that's allowed, which of course is the massive and incredible rule of Amir La'akum is wait or Chayla by Sakana, that even if we're going to have a remedy issue, but if you're doing it via a guy, then it is allowed if it's someone who is bedridden. It says the Gemara, another way of learning in the first medium-sized line, he himself did it. 1 second, what do you think? You tell me you're going with the law that anything can be done by a guy as long as you are bedridden in the level of chayla, of sickness, that you need to go to sleep. But Rav Amnuna taught us called davar she'ein by sakana. That's only when could you allow the guy to do it? Only if you're not helping at all. If the guy's going to go and put an ointment on your arm, if the guy's going to go and administer sort of remedial process that you, the Jew, you, the recipient, are not involved at all. Avomar, but in our case, you're putting an eye ointment. You're helping him. How are you helping him? You have to open up your eye, you got to hold it open. That's misayeh, you're helping. So therefore it shouldn't be allowed. Meaning you're right. The rule was correct that a guy could do processes for someone who's bedridden. However, you are helping him by opening up your eye. So you respond, Rav Zvid, 3 lines at the bottom, holds like me, Vishaniya lady, he explained, Mesayeya ein boy mamish. The act of opening your eye is not called a tangible act, and that's going to be allowed. And we'll just point out that whether we baskin Mesayeya ein boy mamish or not is a massive debate, Shach and Taz, a famous debate with regard to if a woman has to have a nail cut on Yantif. Is it better to get the guy, or Friday night I should say, is it better for the guy to cut it, the guy to clean it? Do we see that for the same thing, holding your finger still, cutting the nails, that's called Misayeh, that's aiding. But as we mentioned in the past, we learned Gemara and Shabbos, there is a Mishnah Berurah and Shin Chav Tes. With regard to Hilchos Refuah, the Mishnah Berurah goes and does quote this Gemara verbatim, Misayeya ein by mamish, so there would be a room for leniency in a situation that one needs someone else to do malacha to him, that he could stand still and allow it to be done, and we would go with the opinion of Misayeya ein by mamish. Of course, you know all the other reasons for leniency, someone is bedridden, etc. Says the Gemara as we about to turn over to Amid Beis, that Meimar Shari leMechayna b'Yantav Sheni Shor Rosh Hashanah. Meimar allowed them to put on this eye ointment on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Meimar, 2 lines at the bottom. Rava, which we've seen a few days ago, that if Maze beyond the Rishai means that's what I'm like Goyim deal with it. Beyond the Shani, if there's someone who dies on the second day, beyond the Batzalacha, he's asked for Yisrael. Va'afilu, and when is this even? Even on 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, turning over to Chav Beis and Beis. However, that was only a special dispensation for a maze. That we're not lenient for an egg. So what do we see? We see that even though medication is permitted on the second day of other Yom Tovim, it should not be allowed in Rosh Hashanah, just like we don't allow for the Beitzah, for the egg, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Amrlei responds, and Akan Ardais Viralei, the Amri. Af Beitzah, it's the same halach with an egg in the second day of Rosh Hashanah. You know why? Because what are you concerned about? You're concerned for Sveikat the Yom, you're concerned that the second day might be a real Yantif, they might go and make Elul Leap month, but of course we know about Rav China Bar Bakana, that never happened, and therefore there is not such a concern. Therefore that is the reason why he was allowed them to be makel on the second day of Yantif, even on Rosh Hashanah. And now, 5 lines for the top of Chabez and Mabez, we get into the third case of the Mishnah. The third time there of Gamliel was stringent like Beis Shammai. Ein oifen pitin geritin al krikim, we don't let you to make the thick loaves, only the wafer type loaves. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbana Beis Shammai oimim ein oifen ba'azav bePesach, Are you allowed to make quote unquote thick bread, which we'll see momentarily what does that mean? Are you allowed to make that on Pesach? Says Beis Shammai, no. Says Beis Hillel, yet. And what does it mean, thick bread? Again, on Pesach. Ravuna tefach, a tefach, thick bread, quite a bread. That's what's forbidden on Pesach. And where do we see the source for this? As we've seen in the Gemara in Yuma, we found that the lechem apanim were tefach thick, and they were not coined a chametz. So too, you'll be allowed to make a bread up to a tefach thick. Maskal Rabbi Yosef Amar B'Zrizin, Yomer B'Shein Zrizin. Hopefully, they should bring back memories. Shimar Psachim. Well, how can you bring a right for lechem apanim? You just told me lechem apanim up to a tefach is not chametz. Says the Gemara, because the Kehanim was reason. They worked, they're very alacrities. They worked on the bread very fast. Number one. Number two, you're going to tell me by bread that's worked on a lot is going to be the same din by a regular piece of bread. Number three, the bread of the fire, the base of Mikdash was very hot and dry wood. By regular fire. Number four, an oven which is always kept extremely hot. Number five, is the first white line. That's a case of a metal oven, of an earthenware oven. So says the Gemara, how can you tell me it's a tefach like the lechem apanim? There were so many differences, so many unique stringencies, so many ways that they ensure that the lechem apanim did not become chametz, whether it's they worked hard, it's very hot, very dry wood, etc. So Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba sheltered this Rabbi B'Yichad. I asked Rabbi this question in private to Manu Rab, and who is that Rab? I asked my Rabbi, I should say, who is that Rab? My bas Abba pas meruba. It doesn't mean bread a tefach thick. It means to make a lot of bread. That was the potential issue, and that was where he was machmir, like the opinion of Beis Shammai, not to do that for Yantiv. A similar way of learning him. Rav Yirmiyah Abraham Rav Shiltas. That's Rabbi. I asked my Rabbi B'Yichad in private. Uman, who is that Rabbeinu Hakadosh? My basava pas meruba. My karle basava. So why are you calling it thick bread? If it's a lot of bread, why is it called basava? There was a lot of kneading done to Tinami Basri Daitana. In that Tana's place, that's what they referred to, a lot of bread. They called it Bas Ava, but we're not referring to very thick bread, rather referring to making a lot of bread. The reason that it's an issue is why? Because it's too much work. It's yantif. We don't want you to sit and make bread after bread after bread. It's an extra exertion, therefore that's the issue. But says the Gemara, if that's true, so what in the world does that have to do with Pesach? This is the same thing on Sukkot coming up today. It's the same thing on Shavuos. Why is this a din of Pesach? My Arya Pesach. Avilu b'shayim most time nami. Even other Yom Tovim as well. Answers the Gemara, you're right. It's not a din in Pesach. It's all Yom Tovim. How beautiful to learn such a Gemara on Sukkot. V'tana beyond the Pesach Kohen. Tana was sitting on Pesach. And they were teaching this halacha, Pesach, that's what we said Pesach, but really it's the exact same halacha. On all Yom Tovim, Tanami Hachi will bring a proof to this point. Beishami Oiminefet and Pas Meruba, Beyom Tivu Beisil Matirim. We see clearly that has nothing to do with Pesach, it's the din in Yantif in general. Beishami forbids, Beisil allowed, and that was the third case where Gamliel was stringent, like the opinion of Beis Shammai, not necessarily to make a thick bread, but to make a lot of bread. For what reason? It's tircha yisira, it's excessive work, and therefore it's not an issue, anything to do with Pesach, it has to do with the regular din of Yantif. Says the Gemara, whenever we mention stringencies, we got to balance it out nicely. Now we got to go for some kulas. So says the Mishnah, Afu Oimer Shleishet Dvarim La'akil. Rav Gamliel said three leniencies. Number one, Mechadem Beis Hamotos. They would sweep in between the beds. Number one. Number two, Manichanes Mugmar, they will leave the incense to burn b'yantif. Number three, Vaisikdima Kulos B'Psachim, they make this kedi, this go with entrails on Pesach, which of course the night of Pesach mimicked the carbon Pesach. Chacham Meiser, in these three cases, the Chacham forbade it, and these are the three leniencies of Rav Gamliel, coming off the three stringencies at the beginning of today's daf. Let's just begin the Gemara. Amar Ravasi Machlokes leGamer Aval Ariach Leverakol Mutter. What is the debate between Rav Gamliel and Chacham is whether you're allowed to burn incense to give a good smell into a garment. Aval Hariach, if you're burning incense just so the house smells nice, that is allowed. And of course, this brings us to the unique and not such known halacha, moilid reich halacha. We pointed out a few days ago that there's an issur d'rabbanan or rabbinical transgression that you're not allowed to make garments to smell good. You're allowed to take the perfume and smell it on spray it in your body, spray it in the air. But you're not allowed to spray it on your garment. It's an issue of tikkun mana, fixing the item. As we see here in the Mishnah, moilid reich, in order to put a good smell into an item is a problem. Says the Gemara, Meisvei have a problem. You're not allowed to sweep between the breads. On Yantiv, shall Beitzah Rav Gamliel, Mechad, they would sweep it. Many times. I went after my father Rav Gamliel to the house of Rav Gamliel. They didn't sweep at all. Beitzah told me they're allowed. And they would just spread out a sheet on the floor. And a primitive tablecloth. When the guests were coming, they would take off the sheet. And the house would be quote unquote swept on its own because they just removed the carpet and the sheet from the floor. So we see that he was stringent and he did not allow them to sweep, which you just told me he did allow them to sweep. If that's what they did, they didn't do anything. It's allowed even on Shabbos. The second case of the Mishnah, you're not allowed to have this incense in Yantiv. Similar story, and they didn't do it. Again, you just told me in the Mishnah that they did this incense, but we see that they didn't. And what they do, they put these iron pipes. They put the smoked incense there in Erev Yantiv, and they would stuff up their holes. And when the guests would come, they want the house to smell well. They would open up the holes and just let this incense to seep out. It would happen on its own, but we see they didn't actually use the incense proper on Yantiv, even just for the house to smell good, not even for the utensils. And Shabbos, can't even allowed on Shabbos. So where do we see these leniencies of Rav Gamliel and Rav Asi machlokes l'ariach? Also, the whole debate is the exact opposite of the Gemara switches. We started off when we said Amar Rav Asi at the beginning of the Gemara, machlokes l'gamer, aval ariach they're called mutter, but we just proved in the price and not that way. So the Gemara concludes and folds and says, you're right, says Rav Asi, the whole debate is l'ariach to make the house smell good. Aval gamer to make your utensils have a good smell. Everyone would agree that is forbidden, and we'll pick off from Yibayelu Mir Hashem tomorrow.